We come now to our shorter catechism lesson today. And today we're looking at question number 67, which asks, which is the sixth commandment? And the answer, the sixth commandment is, thou shalt not kill. You know, it's rather interesting that we would come to this question today after what we've just read. What we've just read in Joshua chapter 6 last week. You remember we read in Joshua 6 last week, the armed men of Israel went into the city of Jericho on that seventh day, marched around the city 7 times, then the trumpets were blown, they let out a loud shout, the walls came tumbling down, and they, quote, devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. And then today we just read in chapter 7, that in their attempt to do the very same thing to the city of Ai, they end up failing. And when Joshua is inquiring of the Lord, why is this happening in light of your promises of the land to us? It's revealed to Joshua that when Achan saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar, silver and gold, that he coveted them and took them, hid them in his tent. Achan took what God had placed off limits and devoted to destruction. And what happened as a result? Not only did they lose the battle, men lost their lives, they then took Achan, his silver, his gold, his tent, his sons, his daughters, everything that he had. They stoned Achan with his family to death, burned them and all that he had, and then buried Achan and his whole household under a pile of stones. It's the same God. It's the same people to whom this same God commanded back in Exodus 20, thou shalt not kill. Well, how can this be? How do we make sense of this? How can we have a clear command from the Lord himself not to take life, and this same God telling these same people to go into a city and wipe everyone out? And not just the men, the women, children, young and old. How can they have a clear command from the Lord himself not to kill, but then punish Achan and his entire family for the crime that he committed? This apparent contradiction in the Bible has baffled a lot of people. For some, especially atheists, they just dismiss the whole thing and say, well, it's all baloney. We don't need to pay attention to any of it. But you even find among Christians who claim to take the Bible seriously. They will do weird things with the Bible, the stories of Joshua, to get around this so-called contradiction. Some claim that these stories of conquest did not actually take place. These are actually elaborate myths, just to teach moral principles. They're mythical stories. Others claim that God did not actually command Joshua and the army to wipe out all these people, but that was Joshua's erroneous interpretation of what God's will was for him in Israel. This is what some Christians are doing with these stories. Even some of the atheists will hear these attempts by some Christians to get around this and recognize the silliness of such attempts to explain what's going on here in Joshua. This still leaves the question, what are we to do with this? How do we resolve this apparent contradiction? How do we make sense of God prohibiting Israel and all of mankind not to kill, then turn around and tell these same people to go into cities and kill everyone in sight? Well, there's 2 things I want you to consider in this brief lesson. First, understand that in the 10 Commandments, while they contain the whole of God's moral law, they are not a full expression of that moral law. We saw this back in question 41 of our catechism. There it says that the moral law is summarily comprehended in the 10 Commandments. It's not exhaustively comprehended, but summarily comprehended. That is, that each one of the 10 Commandments, including this 6th one, is a summary of a moral law or principle. And so where are we to go to get help to help us understand what is being taught in each individual commandment. What is the principle that's being summarized? What is required? What is prohibited? Well, we go to the rest of Scripture. The rest of Scripture provides for us the context in which to understand each of these 10 summaries. In Deuteronomy 4, Moses writes, "He, that is God, declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you are going over to possess." And so God not only gave them the 10 words, the 10 commandments, but he also gave them statutes and rules which would teach God's people how to apply those 10 words, those 10 commandments. It's this additional material that we have in Scripture that helps us to understand the original intent and meaning of each of the 10 commandments. And so when you do all your homework, which a lot of people simply don't, you bring all that context into consideration, you come to realize that this commandment is not an absolute universal prohibition against any and all forms of taking life. Rather, what you come to see is that this is a moral principle, that the moral principle being summarized is that we should not unjustly do any violence towards our neighbor. And this principle is summarized in the wording of the 6th commandment by a prohibition against one particular form of unjust violence, the unjust killing of another person. So this isn't a prohibition against any and all forms of taking life. This commandment is specific to unlawful or unjust killing, or as J. Duma puts it in his book, killing that violates justice. You will see in the context of Scripture as a whole that there are distinctions made about various forms of killing. You will read about distinctions, for example, between voluntary manslaughter versus involuntary. You will read about distinctions between unjustly killing someone without premeditation versus killing someone unintentionally due to carelessness or recklessness. The Bible clearly makes these distinctions. And the 6th commandment is given in that context. You can never be divorced from it. And so the problem with so many people, including some Christians, is that they don't understand the summary nature of the 10 commandments, or the role that the whole of Scripture plays in helping us understand what all is being summarized in the 10 commandments. For many people, they don't even want to consider these things because they're not really interested in rightly understanding the 10 commandments. They're just looking for something to take jabs at God and His Word and His people. I found a contradiction. No, not really. But the second thing I want you to keep in mind here is this. What is undergirding the 6th commandment? What drives it? Or let me ask it another way. Why is it that you might find a Christian who is all about being quote-unquote pro-life, but then takes issues with the stories in Joshua, or may take issue with the idea of capital punishment? I personally have had professing Christians challenge my own claim to being pro-life when it comes to abortion, because I also affirm that a death penalty is a possibility with some cases. And so they argue that I'm not consistently pro-life. If I was really pro-life, I would be against any forms of taking life. Well, why is there a disconnect here? Why is there this seemingly disconnect between this commandment and what God commanded Joshua and the armies of Israel to do? Well, there's a number of disconnect reasons, but I think the primary one here is the failure on some people's part to understand the presupposition behind the 6th commandment. And that presupposition is this. Listen carefully to Genesis 9, 5 through 7. "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." Here we have in Genesis the divine establishment of capital punishment for the unlawful killing of of another person. But notice what that capital punishment is rooted in. It's not rooted in some sort of absolute reverence of life. Because if that were the case, then we shouldn't be putting people to death for killing other people. Rather, it's rooted in the fact that man is made in the image of God. It says it right there. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for, here's your reason he's given you, for God made man in his own image. That is what makes the unjust killing of another person so wicked and heinous. When you unjustly attack someone who is made in the image of God, you are in essence attacking God himself. An assault on the image of God in man is an assault on God. And it is precisely due to that relationship that we have inherently as religious creatures that the reverence and sanctity of life is to be understood. You see, when you take that religious nature that we have as image bearers out of the picture, as so many people do, even including some pro-life Christians, libertarians, and atheists, then what you have done is you have absolutized a reverence of life, quote unquote, that will result in arbitrariness and inconsistency. This is how you get a libertarian, for example, who says on the one hand that he's all about life and the government protecting our life and giving us the right to do what we want as long as we don't hurt others, yet in the same breath will argue for abortion or argue against, putting a serial killer to death. This is what leads to that inconsistency. When you take out the fact that we are religious creatures by nature, by design, that we are made in the image of our God, you remove that, that's what leads to the injustice. That is what leads to the arbitrariness and inconsistency. And when you reach a point where God sees that your life is no longer working to the glory and honor of Him as His image bearer, then that's when you forfeit your life. So we got to get our priorities straight here. It's not an absolute reverence for life's sake. It's life within a certain context, and that is a life of one that is made in the image of God. It is religious relationship that is there that makes us worthy of honor, dignity, and so forth. Well, there's much more that can be said, but we'll reserve that for the next two questions as we get into what is specifically prohibited and what is commanded of us through this commandment.